If you say to someone, you're an anti-Semite, there is no room for discussion. You're done. If you say, I experience what you just said as a threat to me as a Jew, you have an ability to have a conversation. So it is how we talk to each other. It's how we work with each other.
Hey everyone, it's Disagreeing Well, the podcast about polarization, why it matters, what drives it, and what we should do about it. I'm your host, John Malloy, and when it comes to polarizing topics, I don't think you could find one that's more divisive than the Israel-Palestine conflict. Since the events of October 7th, we've seen deep divisions in Canada and elsewhere. Protests, encampments, boycotts, and a never-ending social media firestorm, along with a disturbing increase in both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. It's been a debate without a lot of nuance. Both sides tend to claim the moral high ground, with plenty of name-calling thrown in the mix. For many of us, the topic is a no-go zone. We desperately try to avoid it, particularly around those with strong passions, and in my world at least, there's been a notable absence of the usual panels, workshops, and roundtables to bring together different perspectives in order to build bridges and understanding. Many tend to see it as simply too hot to handle. Well, we here at Disagreeing Well like to think we are brave enough to tackle even the most controversial topics, and we want to devote today's episode to how to talk about the situation in Israel-Palestine. And I want to stress how to talk about it, not how to solve it or who's right and who's wrong, but how do we even bring ourselves to engage on this issue with those who hold differing views, particularly those who feel a connection to the region. And to lead us through this conversation, we welcome Raja Khouri and Jeffrey Wilkinson, authors of the book The Wall Between: What Jews and Palestinians Don't Want to Know About Each Other. Jeff Wilkinson is Jewish. He's originally from the United States, but now lives in Canada and works actively within the Jewish community on the issue of Israel-Palestine. Raja Khouri is a Palestinian Lebanese Canadian, a human rights expert, a founding president of the Canadian Arab Institute, co-founder of the Canadian Arab Jewish Leadership Dialogue Group, and a former commissioner with the Ontario Human Rights Commission. Their book that they jointly wrote is an attempt by a voice from the Jewish world and one from the Arab world to tackle the dysfunctional nature of our discourse on this important and incredibly complicated and emotional topic. Jeff and Raja, welcome to Disagreeing Well.
Thank you for having us, John.
Thank you, John.
So there's so much to talk about today, but I want to take a step back and learn a little bit about each of you and how you came together on this project. I'm sure it's a fascinating story. I don't know, we'll start with you, Jeff, and then move on to Raja.
Well, a Jew and a Palestinian went into a bar. Well, we actually use that as a just kind of promotional for our book. So the truth is that we sort of intertwined at the conversation. So I was doing my doctorate at OISE, and I was looking for victims to be my participants who were Palestinian and Jewish, and have them reflect each other's stories and traumas to each other and respond to those stories. And Raja was introduced by a mutual friend and became a participant in my research. And after the research, I was so moved by Raja's ability to really articulate the Palestinian experience while caring about other experiences as well. And we actually met on a rooftop bar in Toronto and said we should do something. And we talked for a year plus, just listened, just learned, had hummus and other things together, and became deep friends and came to care about each other and about each other's narrative. And our book was really a modeling of the experiences that we had and that we'd seen around us.
And Raja, your side of the story. And what year was this roughly?
We met in about 2015, 2016, and we started working together in 2017.
So, Raja, tell us your side, or a little bit about your background and your side of the story.
Yeah, I was born in Lebanon to Palestinian parents who fled Palestine during the 1948 war and ended up in Lebanon as refugees essentially. And when the war was over, they tried to go back to their homes, and they weren't allowed. Like most Palestinian refugees in the region, were not allowed to go back to their homes in Palestine after the establishment of the state of Israel. I grew up in Lebanon, and luckily, my dad, because we were Christian, we were able to obtain Lebanese citizenship a lot easier, which is how we avoided ending up in a refugee camp. My dad was able to work with, being a citizen and make enough money for us to live among the general population. But the largest segment of Palestinian refugees, did not have citizenship in Lebanon and could not work and stayed in refugee camps where the United Nations Relief and Works Agency supported them, in terms of food and shelter and some work, opportunities within the camps.
For you, Raja, in particular, there's obviously this personal connection to the issue, but has there been a temptation for both of you to just say that's over there and I want to stay far away from this? I mean, why would you go right into such an emotional topic? Is it the personal connection, or is there something bigger? And obviously, I think you're both concerned about the polarization around it.
Having been a human rights commissioner for 10 years, and I came across many Jewish colleagues who were also human rights advocates. That's where we found, that common ground of, respect for all human life and, the universality of human rights, which is when I co-started this dialogue group with Jewish colleagues, trying to find more common ground, trying to find more about each other's story. Believe it or not, I was in my late 40s when I first heard Zionism be described as a movement for self-determination. And in the Palestinian narrative, that doesn't exist. Zionism is seen purely as a destructive force that destroyed Palestinian society in 1947-48, and continued to inflict pain on Palestinians. And then with the occupation of 1967, the oppression of the occupation, and then the siege of Gaza, and then the destruction of Gaza, these are all seen as part and parcel of what Zionism is by Palestinians. So, that kind of narrative difference is why I and I believe Jeff also, wanted to get in this work, because neither side knew the narrative of the other, and therefore a basic point of understanding and commonality was completely missing.
I would add that, for me, it was a journey from personal and familial to collective. That as I became, really interested in trauma and memory, I started with my grandparents' experience in the Holocaust and the Shoah. And I became really, really interested in what they felt and what Jews experienced and how that had translated to how Jews feel today. And then at some point, I became, both intellectually and emotionally curious about stories that I didn't know. And as I understood Zionism as part of a refuge of freedom and redemption after the Holocaust, I was curious about the people, who were there. And so I started asking questions really because I wanted to understand the trauma of it, not just the location of the tribe that was traumatized, but the actual experience of how memory and trauma work. That really led me to be curious and want to understand a larger story. And what really happened with Raj and I is that we saw two established Canadian communities who didn't know each other and didn't want to know each other. And as we got to know each other, we really felt a duty to do something about that. Raj and I both have a strong human rights and social justice background. And the things that have continued to happen in Israel-Palestine and have reverberated here, particularly in the last 2.5 years, show a deep lack of moral courage and humanity. And we wanted to put the focus on the humans that are involved in the story, not in the right and wrong or the politics of the story.
Which then leads to the book. And I mean, the timing of the book is, I'll get you to discuss. I think you shared with me that it was just sort of coming out as the October 7th attacks took place. But tell us a little bit about the background of the book, putting the book together, and then this rather remarkable timing that it was coming out just as we were experiencing really the beginning of the horrific situation in Gaza. So I don't know, Raja, do you want to start?
The timing was pure coincidence. We did not know ahead of time what was going to happen. And it was interesting that in the book we describe the experiences before October 7, and we describe the emotional, trauma-driven reactions that people on both sides have. And then, of course, with October 7 happening, and then followed by the destruction of Gaza, some people, say it was a genocide. It was, like throwing a lot of fuel on a fire that was already lit. And all of a sudden, emotions exploded. They grew exponentially overnight. And Canadians who are not related to the conflict were standing looking at these emotions and trying to figure out what the heck was going on. How is it that this conflict that is taking place thousands of miles away all of a sudden landed in our living rooms, workplaces, schools, universities, streets, and the media with such, polarized and opposite forces pushing, and for people who didn't have any of the background on this conflict, they couldn't figure out, what was going on. And our book happened to be there to help people understand. And we started getting invited to all kinds of places across the continent, places small and big, and churches, not churches, mosques, synagogues. We've been to all of them to try and help people understand why is it that this is such a polarized and polarizing issue.
So just, and maybe I'll turn to Jeff for this. Tell us a little bit about sort of how, I guess, the general themes of the book and how it's put together, because it is, I mean, important to note that it came out what, just before,
Yeah, 4 days before.
4 days before. I mean, it is just a remarkable coincidence. So the basic theme, but obviously extremely relevant to what happened. But tell us about the basic theme.
Sure. So our approach and the way we think of it is framed around trauma-informed work. How we come to know how our identities, our traumas, experiences, memories silo us off into camps. And the resistance often to the other stories because they are the other. They are not us. They're not a belonging. So we set up how trauma works, how identity works, how we become victims. And what we mean by that is not that things happen to us, that victimize us, but the living in fear and feeling that we've always been harmed, always will be harmed. And how that protects us or creates sort of a shield around our tribe so that we don't really listen or understand. So polarization really is the resistance to the idea that there's another story. And so that's what we tried to set up. The heart of the book is really explaining the two groups to each other. So when words that you hear like anti-Semitism, Zionism, apartheid, the Nakba, Palestinian resistance, we break down how each group hears those words entirely differently and how they're already set up to sort of remove us into a bubble and to resist how someone else might feel about it. Super easy way to talk about it, for instance, anti-Semitism. To a Jew, anti-Semitism is the constant reminder and catastrophe of what it's like to be marginalized as a Jew. To a Palestinian, anti-Semitism is often weaponized to silence their resistance to their oppression. So the words have completely different meaning and emotional impact for the groups. So that's really what the book tries to do. And in the end, we try to create some kind of roadmap to how to get out of this pattern.
And I think what's important, or what comes through in the book, this isn't about having strong feelings on the issue. This is the fact that both sides have strong feelings but are not prepared to listen to the other side's story or try to understand the other side's story. And I know there's a quote in the book. It says the need to have our stories heard often prevents us from hearing the stories of the other. So is that sort of the way I've characterized it? What you're seeing happening in this discussion, that people feel very strongly, which, and there's, I think, a degree of legitimacy about it, but it's preventing them from even just listening to the other side. Is that a fair characterization? I don't know, Raja, as you're over to you.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. And one of the early things that I've learned in my dialogue with Jewish colleagues was that the fear is real. Palestinians generally are not aware of the authenticity of this fear. But the fear, Jewish fear is real. Now, of course, when we talk about trauma and the Holocaust, when an entire community is threatened with oblivion, it leaves scars. And I remember telling Jeff, I don't know how a Jew feels because of that experience. I can explain how a Palestinian feels because of their own trauma, the Nakba, the destruction of Palestinian society. The fear is real. Now, with the proviso that it is magnified by advocacy groups who talk a lot about the threat, who exaggerate the threats sometimes to the Jewish communities, to the threat of anti-Semitism, um, and then the confusion of the deliberate conflation of anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. So when a Jew hears something critical of Israel, they're automatically triggered to think that this is a threat to them, that is a Palestinian speaking against their oppression by Israel, then becomes something that they should fear because that person is possibly or probably anti-Semitic disease is being critical of Israel. So that conflation is terrible. It's hurting both communities, and it continues. So these advocacy group kind of manipulate the trauma of both groups with the purpose of keeping people under the control of the message that they want to be sent out. So we have a name for these groups in our book. We call them bad actors, BADD, because what they do is they blame, they attack, demonize, and dismiss. Blame, attack, demonize, and dismiss. So there is one thing in people wanting to spread their message, their narrative. It's another thing when you do that at the cost of someone else's narrative, and you demonize them or you dismiss them because of that narrative. And that's what many of these advocacy groups do.
So Jeff, Raja gave us a sense of some aspects of the Jewish story that the Palestinian community doesn't know. Are there aspects of the Palestinian story the Jewish community doesn't know?
Yes, of course. I think the really important thing to understand is that these stories and experiences for Jews and Palestinians are both existential in nature. It's not about just not understanding, it's about what happens if we truly understand. What changes are we going to have to make? How are we going to have to adjust how we think and how we feel and what we're committed to if we really start to understand the other narrative? Um, the communities have done an excellent job at of staying in a bubble, of teaching, our families, our children, a single story. And the brain is very good at single, simple stories. It doesn't really like complicated stories because it puts danger, in play. So for Jews, the comfortable story is that it wasn't our fault that bad things have happened to Palestinians because of Zionism. War happens, bad things happen in war. They could have done a better job. They could have, accepted the partition plan of 1948. They could have done all kinds of things differently. We've offered them lots of things. They've never accepted it. This entire narrative is constructed so we don't have to actually deal with the consequences of our freedom on Palestinians. So the Jewish community may know, parts of the Jewish community know parts of the Palestinian story, but what they're primarily exposed to is the story of redemption of Israel, of the feeling that we now have agency over our own control, that we have our own control, that people are not going to threaten us in the way they have for 2,000 years because we have our own state. And the Palestinians, unfortunately, become sort of a casualty, a story that if we really knew it, we might have to reconsider what we currently have. We're going to talk about this more as we go along, but the essence of polarization in the Israel-Palestine milieu is that the alternative to polarization is dealing with deeply uncomfortable and painful realities, that Jews have suffered a myriad of difficulties for 2,000 years: murder, genocide, ostracization, removal, and the freedom that we experience from the founding of the State of Israel and the establishment of Zionism was done on the backs of somebody else. And these are deeply painful truths. And for Palestinians, as Raja had already talked about, and we'll talk about more, I'm sure, to realize that even though what Jews have done to Palestinians is horrible, the Jewish pain and trauma story is a real story, not one that was made up.
And one very relevant reality is that after the end of the Second World War, the Jewish refugees in Europe were looking for a safe place to settle in, and no one wanted them. England didn't want them, France didn't want them. They tried coming to North America, United States didn't want them, Canada didn't want them. Our prime minister at the time said, "None is too many," about Jewish refugees. So there was a reality of these refugees needing a safe place, and nobody wanted them, and they ended up going to Palestine. Not by accident. I mean, Zionism, since the end of the 19th century, was calling for a Jewish home in Palestine. But the fact that they had nowhere else to go certainly ended up with most of the Jewish refugees from Europe being in Palestine and displacing the Palestinian population, taking their homes and living in them, not allowing them back, because the idea of Zionism has always been a Jewish majority state, and that remains the case, which is really one of the most complicating factors for a resolution to this conflict.
But how do you respond to people who say, look, this is about good versus evil, and both sides would say that, and that what you're asking is not to try to understand the other side, but to compromise my views, to abandon my views, to abandon my beliefs? I mean, for a lot of people, this is very much a question of the moral high ground, and they may hear part of that call that, yeah, I want to hear what the other side has to say, but I'm not prepared to change my core beliefs.
That's another simple story, as Jeff was talking about earlier. We're the good guys, they're the bad guys. It's binary, either us or them. You're either with the genociders or with the terrorists, as you mentioned, early on. Some people like to position this as a religious conflict between Muslims and Jews, and all of that is nonsense. Of course, there are religious elements. I mean, after all, it's the Holy Land. But the conflict is about land and about identity. Palestinians, lost their society in 1948 and are trying to, claim it back. Jews needed a refuge and they came to Palestine. And now the story has become that this is their ancestral land. And I mean, you can't, I don't know, about 2,000 years later, you can back say, well, I used to live here. You get out once land back. Doesn't make sense, but it's a feel good story. Jeff, you probably want to address the other side of the question.
Well, Jeff, there are many voices, and we're for obvious reasons asking you to reflect on some of the arguments made by the Jewish community that this is a question of good versus evil, and there may be a little bit of room for dialogue, there may be a little bit of room for understanding, but don't ask me to abandon my core beliefs. I mean, what would you say to members of the
Sure,
Jewish community who say that?
sure, sure. So the only thing I can tell you is where we've had success. And where we've had success is in the emotional field. Even the sort of setup to what we're doing here, which is to disagree, politely or agreeably, we actually don't deal in the field of disagreement. We try to help people come to a place of understanding and empathy for the humanity of the other group. And we do that through a shared experience of grief and trauma. That when you ask Jews and Palestinians how they've been feeling since October 7th, they feel very similarly. Their pain, their sorrow, their grief, their anxiety, their loss is very similar. We have a line in a book, and we often use in our talk, that we need to shift from not who is right, but what is right. So the change comes not by trying to convince somebody that their narrative is incorrect or that they need to give up something, but to be able to sit with another person as a fellow human, to hear their suffering, to hear what their world looks like. Two simple examples. So from the Jewish side, a lot of what we've heard in the last 2.5 years is people want them to understand how October 7th landed for them, how it was such a shock and re-experiencing many ways of historical trauma. And that when Palestinian or pro-Palestinian groups pretty well immediately started to protest what Israel was doing and assumed what would happen, and they were right about what would happen, for most in my community, that was seen as utter betrayal. We're in our moment of great need, and you are telling us that it's our fault. That's how it was read by many, many, many Jews. So when Palestinians have been confronted with that story, they're generally able to really empathize with what that feels like, because their entire life experience has been that their story has not been recognized or valued or appreciated. And so, as we'd said before, when Jews tell you they're afraid, they're being honest with you. They are afraid. And maybe Raja will talk a little bit about how Jews have come to understand what it's like as a Palestinian, for example, to have your sort of credibility question is, do you condemn Hamas? And how affronting that is to a Palestinian, after 2.5 years of the destruction of Gaza.
Raja, that I think is the first question out of many commentators' mouths when they're arguing the pro-Israel side and talking about oftentimes about Palestinians, not with Palestinians, are saying, have they haven't condemned Hamas, they haven't gone far enough in terms of condemning terrorism. So Jeff's pointed out that's seen very differently from the Palestinian side.
Yeah, I mean, the question of do you condemn Hamas is highly reductionist. Whether a particular militia's actions reflect or represent the Palestinian experience or um, the Palestinian desire for liberation. Why is it so hard for the West to understand that Palestinians want freedom? They were robbed of that freedom in 1948 and they were never able to get it back. Even the Palestinians who are citizens of Israel today are second class citizens by law. The law in Israel favors Jews over any other ethnicity or religion. And then, of course, you've got Palestinians in the West Bank who have been living under a brutal occupation since 1967. That's 59 years. And then Gaza was under siege for 15, 16 years under a brutal siege where people had no freedom of movement. Even the water that they were receiving were ration provided them, by Israel. They had no control over their lives. They had no hope for the future. And then they got bombed, for 2 years. So a Palestinian carries all this pain. And then you come and ask them whether you condemn Hamas as if that one day in this entire history is more important than anything else, that nothing happened before or after that day. How
And
reductionist it is,
sorry,
and that's why so offensive.
sorry, Raja, absolutely. And the complexity is that if we are to come to understand each other, we also have to understand the impact of October 7th on Jews, whether it's rational or otherwise, and the rise of anti Semitism, some of which is, as Raja has already said, is exaggerated by interest groups who want to keep us as far apart as possible. But there is a reality that when there is violence in Israel-Palestine, there is an uptick in anti-Semitic incidents around the world. So it's about holding the complexities. It's not about resolving them, but it's about holding them. Just gently to push the point about the concept of how we talk to each other, to disagree. There's an old saying about we need to learn to disagree, but to do it agreeably. I would offer to you that that's the wrong framework. We need to learn the story and experience of our neighbors that we don't know. And a natural byproduct of doing that is to begin to include their story and our story. Polarization can only exist if the other story exists only as a threat to our story. If the other story becomes entangled with our story, it's no longer polarized.
Right now I can just hear all the voices on both sides saying, yeah, but. And I
We've
guess
we've never heard that before, John.
you've never heard that before.
No.
In my mind, one of the most complicating factors of this discussion in particular, but there's a number of other ones that fall into the same category, is so much of it's about emotion, it's about trauma. We all recognize that large percentage of the time, the absolute worst thing you can do is to say, yeah, but on date X, in treaty Y, in statement Z, in to throw the facts up, to try to undermine. I mean, it's quite something when you see posts on the Middle East that will have every third fact will be sort of highlighted and you click on it and it never goes to some academic, it goes to some article somewhere or this, there, and they're trying to argue every little point with their set of facts. And I get it. It's the emotion, it's the trauma. The facts aren't going to help. But at the same time, what about these facts? What about the history? What about basic verifiable points that each side holds so dear? I mean, the frustration of telling them that no, they can't deal with it. It's the yeah buts. How do you deal with that to try to begin this engagement?
People often take the easy way out. Uh, Either could be the easy intellectual way out or the easy emotional way out. It's a lot easier to hate than it is trying to understand. It's a lot easier to think that we are the good guys and they are the bad guys. End of story. I don't have to work on it. And then the people that we work with are people who they are okay with being in discomfort of the other narrative. The other narrative is certainly discomforting. But the people we work with are those who actually value humanity, value everyone's humanity. what you find on the advocacy sphere is people demonizing each other and trying to convince everyone that the other side is less human. They don't deserve to be treated like humans. I mean, reducing Palestinians to Hamas or reducing Palestinians to on October 7 is very dehumanizing, and it makes it easier for people to blame Hamas and Palestinians, of course, because they're all Hamas, supporters for everything. So even when the Netanyahu government was deliberately starving Palestinians in Gaza, there were those who were saying there is no such thing as starvation in Gaza. It's all made up, or it's Hamas's fault. Hamas is actually the one who's keeping the food. So these kinds of arguments, I have no time in my life for them because we've seen what the demonization of the other has done to us. We've been seeing it since 1947. This has been going on for almost 80 years, and that only has led to more suffering, more anguish, and renewed trauma, and so on. So I like to spend my time with people who believe in humanity, who are okay with being uncomfortable and hearing the other side, and then realizing things that they have never realized before. In one of our sessions, a couple of the Jewish participants, they just all of a sudden said, "Wait a minute! We just realized that the Palestinians, who had nothing to do with our Holocaust, with anti-Semitism in Europe, are the ones who have ended up suffering, paying the cost of our liberation, of Jewish liberation." They came to the realization because they were willing to listen. They were willing to hear the other narrative. And I mean, for me, of course, I always knew that, but they didn't. And each side is blind to some of the narrative of the other side.
It's gonna. If I could add, John, I know you want to ask a question, but maybe it leads to your next question. Is that I have a question for the yeah butters who will listen to this session. Where has it gotten us? I mean, we already started. Just this last part, Raja started to go there, but I want to take it really seriously. Where have you ever had success in your life? With a partner, a spouse, a business partner, a child, arguing about who's right, trying to one up the other person. The situation in Israel Palestine is a moral, human catastrophe. It has been for a long time and it's gotten worse. The time to argue about our points about, well, what about this and what about that? And, weren't it, isn't it because of the Ottoman Empire? Weren't Jews always there? And, and all we know all the arguments very well. We're well versed. In the end, it has gotten us to constant killing. Raj and I are guided by the fact, the truth, the hard fact that every single person who dies in Israel Palestine dies unnecessarily. Every Palestinian who dies, every Jew who dies unnecessarily because we have been unable, unwilling, incapable of caring about each other. And so, yes, you can stay in your argument space if you want, and we will continue to suffer constant loss.
The land needs to be shared. The land of historic Palestine needs to be shared in a way that both peoples have similar rights, similar access, similar opportunities, and similar, place in the law of the land. That can take 5 weeks or it can take 50 years. Until it happens, there will not be any peace. And the only way that's going to happen is by appreciating the humanity and the righteousness of both communities, and the need for them to have equal access and equal opportunities.
So one of the points you make in the book is that we're going to have a different view of history, in the sense, I don't mean the actual subject of history, but that fighting battles of the past, as you said, hasn't gotten us very far, that this may be the moment to be looking forward, to be taking the reality of the situation and moving forward. And that's the one thing that's always struck me about these discussions in the Middle East. It's hard to think of another discussion, even, indigenous reconciliation in Canada or other ones that are historically grounded, where you spend so much time on the past and not as much time on the present and the future. So, I see that as one of the ways forward that you outlined in the book. Have I characterized it well there?
We call it separating the past from the present. And this is a basic tool of repair and recovery from any painful, traumatic situation. If you if the past events narrate your present, they are guaranteed to narrate your future. So the only way to create a new future is to have your present guided by what is, what the possibilities are right now. Um, it's always important when we do this toss because there's this sort of sense of, well, this is pie in the sky ideology and kumbaya. Not in the least. We have been on a destructive path, not just in this issue, but in many issues. And the destruction is caused by losing sight of the fact that the person you have a different viewpoint with is indeed a person, has the same blood and flesh that you have. That when a Palestinian mother grieves the death of a child, it's no different from a Jewish mother dealing with the death of her child. It's grief. It's not identity grief. It's not Palestinian grief or Jewish grief. It's just grief. And if we are serious about tackling rampant polarization, which is true in many issues, not just Israel-Palestine, we're going to have to start to be willing to see someone we disagree with as a person who has different viewpoints and different ideas, not different humanity. And I don't know how else to help people understand that to move forward, this is what we must do. And it is urgent. We're sitting here in the comfort of our offices having a conversation. The people over there don't have that luxury. And it is time that we, in our discourse here in Canada, begin to truly respect that we have the privilege to sit with each other. There's no bombs falling. There's no guns attacking us. We are sitting in privilege, and we have the privilege to have the conversation. And it's time that we grasp that privilege and take it by the throat.
So, what do you say to the yeah buts about engaging in this? Because the message that you're giving is one that, quite frankly, there's all sorts of people on both sides. I'm not picking on one side over the other. They're going to dismiss with the yeah buts. How do we get people to start with, to listen to the other side's story?
One of the issues, the problems with the conversation that we have here is for Palestinians at least, it's the both sidism. This is not a conflict between equal sides. I mean, Israel's military might is very well known, and its ability, to crush Palestinians, was exercised very efficiently, in Gaza. Not only just choosing targets of Hamas, they flattened the entire Gaza Strip. And over here in Canada and North America in the West, there are very powerful pro-Israel institutions, and and the Jewish community has established itself very well in North America, and some of these organizations abuse the power that they have and use it to silence and dismiss the Palestinians and the Palestinian supporters. We saw it happen during, the last 2 years, where pro-Palestinian rallies were called terror supporters. Now, these rallies were in support of Palestinians who were being brutally bombed on a daily basis, with thousands and thousands being killed, and yet, there was this: you're supporting terrorism, you're not supporting you're not supporting a just cause, which is the humanity, of Palestinians. And that was repeated by, Doug Ford and Pierre Poilievre. I mean, which is, it shows that, Palestinians and their supporters in this society here have an uphill battle ahead of them. That the establishment is not fair, and it's not just in the way it sees them and their narratives. The with respect to the yes but people, when we work with people, we tell them that the first rule is that you want to be here. You're not here to argue, you are here to try and listen and understand. When a Palestinian tells you a story, or a Jew tells you their story, you accept that story and you don't argue with yes but. You start with these personal stories that there's no yeah butters in there. This is my story, and I'm going to tell it to you. And you have to actually want to do that. Or, as Jeff often says, we work with people even who want to, or may not necessarily today want, but want to want. And everybody else is part of the problem. We look for people who can be part of the solution.
I would also say, John, that we've had a real dearth of intellectual honesty and integrity in this conversation, because people are looking. The first question when they talk to us is, whose side are you on? Are you going to be for me? Are you going to be for them? This is the human experience. And I don't think what we've done is to say that there is no argument with both over there and over here, that no matter which side you support, you've made tons of mistakes. And that certainly the quality of debate has really descended. That people use very simplistic, binary, polarizing language, purity language. You're 100% this or 100% that. Even people who have a righteous anger about about the things Israel does, when you use language like the Zionist entity, so called Israel, you're going to inflame people. You're not going to have the ability to have a conversation. So we're all responsible for how we talk, for how we listen, simplistic views of the other. And I'm going to be really clear about it. If you say to someone, you're an anti Semite, there is no room for discussion. You're done. If you say, I experience what you just said as a threat to me as a Jew, you have an ability to have a conversation. So it is how we talk to each other. It's how we work with each other. If you say to a Jewish person, you just love killing Palestinians, you can't have a conversation. If you say, I'm grieving the loss of my cousin who died in Gaza, you can have a conversation. This type of integrity has really been missing from the general discourse here.
So tell me, you've mentioned your work. Tell me about the work that you've done. I know some of it's on university campuses and elsewhere, of bringing these people together who at least have shown some sort of openness to the idea of having this engagement.
One of the interesting things we've observed is that when we went to university campuses, or actually a number of other kinds of settings, workplaces, there are those who want to speak with us, who want to tell us their narrative, who want to tell us their story. And there are those who refuse to meet with us. And we found that those who refuse to meet with us, they can be pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli. It depends on whether they trust the institution that they're in, and whether they're going to lose something by engaging. So if they thought that, telling us their narrative is something that can gain them something, they're happy to talk. Or if it's going to, have require them to give up something, for instance, any privileges that they already have, then they don't want to engage with this kind of conversation. The idea of the narrative here is critical because, to Palestinians, their narrative has historically been not known or misunderstood, or there was no interest in it. There was a prevailing narrative that fit the Western and Israeli agenda that dominated. So when we first started, on our tour, we would ask audiences, how many people here know about the Holocaust. Of course, everybody does. How many people here know about the Nakba? And you'll get a smattering of hands. Within a year, we started getting a majority of the people in the room having known what the Nakba is. So I'm saying this because it has been a boost to Palestinians that their narrative is finally being heard, that the progressive forces in North America have now come to understand the Palestinian cause and have picked it up. But that has also contributed to complications because for some in the Jewish community who have always seen themselves as part of the progressive left, they felt betrayed by the left turning. They saw it as turning on them, and the language used, the settler colonial language, the all those kind of things added to the complexity of the conversation. What we push is one agenda, and that agenda is of justice and human rights. You can't talk about peace without these two elements. That's been gaining ground in North America like never before, and the resistance to it has also been gaining because it's seen as a threat to the other narrative.
Can you tell me a little bit about the tour and how it works and what some of the other work that you've been doing? I guess if people are interested in learning more.
Well, we've done a variety of things. We'll divide them kind of into three things. We do public talks. That's by far the majority of what we've done across the US and Canada, sometimes online, usually often in person, all over from one side of the country to another, in churches, mosques, synagogues, public spaces, workplaces. So that's sort of our first thing, which is really modeling our how we talk to each other and trying to create a deeper understanding of the issues and of how to care about Jews and Palestinians from a moral perspective. The second part is we've worked with organizations that have struggled with this issue tearing them apart. Students, faculty, employees who used to get along who can't talk to each other because of this issue, who want to move their desk because the person beside them has a Palestinian flag or wears a keffiyeh to work, or a Mogen David on their neck. So we've been consultants and continue to consult and help people who have these conflicts. And the third one that we're doing a lot more of these days, we call transformational conversations, which is actually bringing Jews and Palestinians in a room, usually for multiple sessions, to really go through an emotional process of beginning to understand and appreciate the other, and to build alliances based on that appreciation. So those are the three sort of general things that we've been doing. We also have written a lot of articles, been on lots and lots of news programs, because people want to know. In part, they want to know something overly simple, which is how come a Jew and a Palestinian can talk to each other? Because we're humans, because we're brothers, because we're friends, because our humanity matters way more than our identity, because we are guided by our values, not by our past or our background.
I've come to appreciate Judaism through my relationship with Jeff, because we arrived at at the same values. We talked about justice, humanity, human rights, and all that stuff. He arrived at them through his Judaism. I arrived at them through my human rights work, but we arrived at the same place. When you have really these kinds of similar values, it's not hard at all for trust to build and for there to be intellectual honesty, for there to be empathy. It is not that hard.
Can I ask for advice for listeners who are not don't have those direct ties, who are not Jewish, who are not Palestinian, who are not just, and perhaps people who have not taken an active stand or an active role? I said right at the beginning. I mean, for some of us, this is the third rail. Someone brings it up, you sort of silently hope that the conversation ends and you can move on to talk about sports or something, because it's so divisive, so emotional. I mean, what advice for those of us who are trying to walk a tightrope? I have friends who feel very strongly on both sides of this issue. I have questions and concerns on both sides of this issue. I agree 100% that both sides have made lots of mistakes, and this isn't some fight between the 100% good on one side and the 100% evil. So how are we to fit into this work that you're doing?
Well, I think you've started, with the key issue, which is that you'd be hard pressed to meet someone who doesn't have some sphere of influence in their life who feel opposite about this story. We've talked to so many people who feel their life is a tightrope, that with one friend, they ask certain questions and act in a certain way, and with another friend, they act entirely differently. Really, essence, if there's an umbrella question that people want to know, is how did this thing, over 10,000 kilometers away, like actually end up in my kitchen? Like, how did that happen? So they really want to know. So the first advice is, how do you listen empathetically? Your job is not to agree or to say something that's going to make the other person feel better. It's about listening, it's about caring. And if you have a trusting relationship with someone and they say something that either be false or hurtful, then you can take the opportunity to ask them to consider how that might land for the person on the opposite side of the street. You're delicate about how you do this. We think that it's very helpful to see Israel-Palestine as a case study of polarization rather than to talk specifically about all of the complex issues. Because at its core, it is just a magnified way that any issue can be polarized. So if we understand the differences between Jews and Palestinians, between pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian, as very human differences of perspectives, of viewpoints, of histories, of learning, um, how we experience the world is an aftermarket experience. We don't come into the world with a certain set of understandings. They're taught, and therefore they can be unlearned if they've been learned. So I think the real essence is to provide opportunities for unlearning. We don't try to teach anybody anything. We try to give them a platform where they can unlearn something.
We often ask people, how do you know that? They'll say something like, well, if the Arabs had, accepted the partition plan, there would have been peace. And I said, how do you know that? We don't. We just simply don't. We don't know what would have happened. The other day, a Jewish friend of mine was telling me that her father believes that all Arabs want to do is kill Jews. Now, he's never met an Arab in his life, but he believes that. Now, how did that person come to believe that? This is the challenge, we often put people through when they make statements that they're so sure of. How did you know that? Why did you choose to believe this? That's kind of unpacking, is necessary to separate propaganda and misinformation, disinformation from one's own real history and what they have come to experience themselves. You need to separate those two to get to the real emotional state and why are people choosing to believe certain things and to disbelieve other things.
Absolutely. And, I think I would really offer thoughtfully to folks to understand that the patterns that we develop are not based on whether they're healthy or not. The patterns we develop are based on whether they are familiar. And we actually, as humans, will live in toxic, difficult situations because we know them. And being certain is very comforting. Joy, learning, growing always begins in the field of uncertainty. So we'd really encourage your audience and, particularly students and, other young people to recognize that information is never dangerous, that learning about something that's different from what you knew is not threatening.
The other thing, we often tell people is when you hear something that is, when I hear an argument that is demonizing of another group, stop reading, stop listening, stop watching. It's not going to get you anywhere good. There's, again, I'd say this again, is one thing to put forward the narrative, your story. Another thing is to be blaming and demonizing someone else of it. And these days, there's a lot of demonization, going on. That you hear things like there are no innocent people in Gaza. That's a very demonizing, statement. And once you start, getting carried away by these kinds of statements, you're going to end up in a very ugly place. So this is why we tell people, any demonizing statement, just ignore it. Move on.
I hope that your audience is hearing that it doesn't matter who it comes from or who the target is. Raj had an excellent example. We've also heard people say, that all Zionists are baby killers. Does the exact same effect.
Yeah. I mean, the level of discourse is just some days just astounding. There's so much that we could continue on. I mean, obviously, this is, I think I get no argument, one of the most complicated and emotional topics. But you've been very generous with your time. One final question. The book, The Wall Between What Jews and Palestinians Don't Want to Know About Each Other, came out just before the events of October 7th. And I understand that you're updating the book and there'll be a new version. So I know people will be anxious to hear about that. So if you want to share a bit about the new book or the new edition of the book.
The title of the new edition is The Wall Between How October 7 and Gaza Have Changed the Narratives. We talk about the first edition, we take the main subjects in the first edition and then explain how they manifested in the last 2 years plus. So we talk about trauma again, we talk about propaganda and bad actors. We talk about continue, Jeff. Say so.
Well,
Continue that sentence.
the real essence of the updated edition is we lived in a noisy, difficult, sort of cacophony of difference. October 6th, 2023. This has been magnified many, many fold. So, how do you now sit with what's happened? How do you process the voluminous attacks on both sides here? Particularly, how do you deal with the fact that while the tragedy of October 7th is deeply real and rising anti Semitism is deeply real, how do you deal with the profound efforts to demonize the very natural resistance to the tragedies of Gaza and the West Bank? And we really try to help the reader hear what they've heard about and process it in a different way. It is likely a little more pointed in some ways because the the necessity to do something different has the stakes are higher.
And when's it expected out?
It is expected probably late spring, so early May, late April, early May. And we will, of course, have context. All of your listeners can go to our website, www.conversationswithoutwalls.org, and you can subscribe and you will get updates of when the book is out, or all of our speaking. You will see all of our videos, all of the interviews that we've done, and easily get in touch with us at thewallbetweenbook@gmail.com, thewallbetweenbook@gmail.com.
Great. And we can certainly share information about the website as we promote this podcast. So listen, thank you very, very much. This is such a difficult issue, but it really is the polarizing issue of our day, and a podcast on polarization that doesn't take a look at this and take a look at the important work you're doing trying to get people to engage in this issue. So thank you for your time today, for sharing your insights and your work and advice on how to deal with this tragic issue, I think, for both sides, and one that is unfortunately tearing us apart. So once again, thank you for being guests on Disagreeing Well.
Thank you, John.
Thanks for having us, John.
Next week, Disagreeing Well welcomes Christian philosopher Jeffrey Dudiak, author of Post-Truth, Facts and Faithfulness. Together, we'll explore the question of truth and examine how our understanding of it may relate to combating polarization.
I often think that people who take their signs down to the legislature, the front of the sign should read, "We're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore." And the back of it should read, "And I realize I don't see everything." I think that if we had that attitude where, yeah, we're going to stand up for something, but we need to walk with some humility and with some care, because when we take big steps, we step on something or someone.
You've been listening to Disagreeing Well, a production of the Center for Public Ethics at Martin Luther University College, federated with Wilfrid Laurier University, located in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada. Disagreeing Well is produced and edited by Lauren Kivenhoven, with additional production and promotional support from Hardika Ahuja. Our theme music is Stuck in Dreams by Kulikova, courtesy of Pixabay. You can find Disagreeing Well on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and please follow us there. To find links to each episode, show notes, and to learn more about the work of the Center for Public Ethics, you can also follow us on our free Substack. Thanks for listening.